Lecture 10, John Locke, The Revolution in Knowledge.
Welcome to Lecture 10, John Locke, The Revolution in Knowledge. If we were a course in the analytic history of philosophy, we would be spending almost no time on John Locke. John Locke is not highly regarded by 20th century philosophers. They rarely find that he formulated his arguments in the most interesting or compelling form. They rarely take seriously issues he addresses while dodging, in their view, certain essential issues and questions that arose later. And were we a course in philosophy as taught by philosophers, John Locke would not loom large in our agenda. But this permits us to see one of the most striking differences between two wholly valid but different disciplines: the analytic history of philosophy and intellectual history, in which it is the behavior of the thinking community of human beings over time that is the object of our interest. And in intellectual history, the role of John Locke is almost incalculable in its importance. Put most simply, Locke triumphs. And for over 100 years in Europe, after Locke writes, he will be the epistemological authority and influence on almost all major and influential European thinkers. People call themselves Lockean with a fervor. It links them, they believe, to the intellectual revolution of the 17th century and to what they take, however mistakenly from the perspective of 20th century philosophers, what they take in the late 17th and in the 18th century to be the most clear and coherent explanation of the origins and nature of human knowledge, of epistemology. If one thinks about it, the role of epistemology and any change in epistemology, a theory of knowledge, is crucial, because how you think about knowledge, how it is acquired, what it is, what are its possibilities, what are its limits, how one goes about knowing, how one tests one's knowledge. How you think about those issues influences every particular subject that you think about. A change in epistemology, a change in thinking about thinking, affects every particular aspect of human thought in a culture. And John Locke is the most influential epistemological thinker from the 17th century upon the history of the 18th century. One of the reasons for this, if one thinks about the Newtonian achievement and the culture's perception of it that we discussed in our prior lectures, is that the culture is convinced that John Locke has provided an account that, in addition to being internally powerful and in addition to being consistent with what we observe and know empirically about how human beings and the human mind behaves, how human beings learn, that John Locke has provided a system that accounts for the scientific revolution of the 17th century. That he has given the epistemological foundations of the way the great natural philosophers, what we would now term the great scientists of the 17th century, came to accomplish what they accomplished and came to know what they knew. In the textbooks of both the history of philosophy and a great deal of intellectual history, Locke is used to create a sharp distinction between, on the one hand, the rationalism of René Descartes, the belief that reason alone, unaided by the senses, yields knowledge about the world, and empiricism on the other, Locke's empirical epistemology in which ideas are acquired from our experience of the world. But that distinction between Descartes' rationalism on the one hand and Locke's empiricism on the other is much too sharply drawn and is almost permanently overdrawn in our textbooks and in the legacy of our teaching. So let's pause a moment and mute some of that distinction before we look at Locke's epistemology in and of itself. First, in terms of Descartes' alleged pure rationalism, understand the full scope given to empiricism within Descartes' philosophy. Descartes rationalistically gives us a criterion of truth. If you think back to that lecture, he gives us the existence of God, the existence of mind as something distinct from body and pure spirit, and of the material world, extension, matter in motion according to the laws of mechanics. And indeed, in terms of his mechanics, Descartes even deduces the physical law of inertia from the fixed and immutable will of a perfect God. But once Descartes has reached that point, his system in terms of studying the natural world becomes empirical. The only way in the Cartesian system to understand plant physiology, animal physiology, the behavior of bodies is to study them empirically, to experiment, to observe. Descartes works on and invites great experiments in physiology, the study of brain and central nervous system, the study of animal behavior and plant behavior, and the physics of all moving bodies. So there is a moment in Descartes' rationalism where reason says, in order to know what follows about the natural world, you need to open your eyes and look. Reason won't give you the answer. You have to study the phenomena of nature. So there is much more of the empirical in Descartes than is commonly conceded by categorizing him as an absolute rationalist. In the same manner, when John Locke thinks not about our knowledge of the world, which, as we'll see for Locke, can only be probable, but when Locke thinks about truth, Locke is, on issues of truth, a pure rationalist. Truth, as opposed to probability for Locke, doesn't pertain to our propositions about the world. Those can only be probable based upon experience. Truth for Locke pertains to the relationship among ideas, the relationship between any two ideas and among a large number of ideas. So in Book 4 of Locke's essay concerning human understanding, when he addresses the issue of truth, the sort of example he gives is as follows. If I ask how many people are in a room, are there 5 people or 6 people? That is an empirical proposition, an empirical question. And I could be wrong in my counting. That is not an issue of truth. Someone might be well camouflaged. Someone might be hiding wonderfully. I might miscount. But if I compare the idea of 5 and the idea of 6, my mind is intuitively certain that 6 is more than 5. Has my neighbor drawn a triangle or a circle in his backyard? That's an empirical issue, and I might make an error in my assessment. But that a triangle is not a circle, that a square is not a circle, that 3 is more than 2 and less than 4, those are relationships between ideas, and there Locke tells us we know the truth by an intuitive certainty, by what Locke calls, in a manner similar to Descartes' clear and distinct ideas, the bright sunshine of the mind. The mind is directed to consideration of the two ideas, and no sooner does it consider them than it sees with full intuitive certainty relationships of identity, similarity, difference that are intuitively true. So Locke's theory of truth is rationalistic. Descartes' theories of physiology, physics, have vast, essential empirical components, and it is not in a distinction between absolute empiricism and absolute rationalism that the drama of the Cartesian-Lockean contest should be understood. What then are the real debates between Locke and Descartes? They are, above all, on two central issues. First, what is the goal of fundamental natural philosophy? What should we be using our minds for? What are the fruits of the use of our minds? The second debate is what is the source of our ideas and what follows from identifying that source. For Descartes, the goal of fundamental natural philosophy is to know truth about the real qualities of the world. Think back to our discussion of Descartes. It is the philosopher stepping out of the cave of appearances, those shadows reflected on the wall, and looking at things as they truly are, the real substances, the real qualities of the world. For John Locke, that kind of knowledge is not available to human beings. It is not within the power of the human mind to know such things. And the goal of fundamental natural philosophy for Locke is knowledge of our experience of the world and an ordering of our experience of the world, precisely how things occur to the human mind on that wall of human experience. The second great debate, I said, is over the source of our ideas. For Descartes, the senses are so errant, and yet we are capable of, in certain ways, whole and complete knowledge, because we find within our minds, before we consult the senses, before we know, in fact, that we have body, that we have senses, that we are not just a mind, that we are not just a dream, we have ideas innate in us. We find in our mind the idea of God. We find in our mind the idea of perfections. We find in our mind the idea of mind, of spirit, and the idea of body. God has created us with minds or souls that have innate ideas. And identifying the truth about those ideas, one may proceed deductively by reason, as Descartes does in the Meditations, to see what logically follows from our clear and distinct innate ideas. For John Locke, all ideas are acquired by experience. There are no innate ideas. If there were, Locke argues in Book 1 of his celebrated essay concerning human understanding, then children would have them. Then idiots would have them. But we do not observe children with the idea of perfect being, of clarity and distinction, of perfections, because those ideas are acquired. There are no innate ideas. There is one of the most central points of contention between Descartes and Locke. How then are ideas acquired? For Locke, all ideas are acquired by two kinds of experience. Often in the textbooks, one will see Locke associated with what is termed sensationalism, the belief that all ideas are acquired by the experience of the senses. But that is not Locke's view in his theory of knowledge. For Locke, we have two kinds of experience, each of which is a source of our ideas. First, we have sensation. We experience the world through our five senses, and from those experiences of the senses, from sensation, we acquire ideas about the world. And that is the source of our ideas about the natural world in which we find ourselves, the world exterior to ourselves. But there is a second source of ideas for Locke, namely reflection. Because the mind is aware not only of the experience of the senses, it is aware of its own experience in dealing with, in operating upon the ideas acquired from the senses. So, for example, from sensation, I acquire the idea of my neighbor's house and my idea of an architectural plan. But then my mind does something. It compares the two. And it is from reflection that I derive the idea of comparison. It judges which is superior. And from reflection, not the senses, I derive the idea of judgment. It chooses one or the other. And from reflection, I acquire the idea of will, of choice. From reflection, I acquire the idea of computation, abstraction, addition, multiplication. These are not acquired by sensory experience. So, contrary to the presentation of Locke as a strict sensationalist, for Locke there are two sources of ideas. Sensation, from which we derive our sense of the world external to us, and reflection, from which we derive our ideas of all mental and volitional activities, of all ideas relating to the use of reason and understanding, and all ideas relating to the will and choice. In Locke's model, all knowledge begins with what he terms simple sensations or simple reflections, which then combine to form complex ideas. For example, experiencing individual human beings, cities, horses, streets, I combine those into the idea of city. And the model, and it is explicitly Locke's model, is one of the construction of molecules from atoms. Locke has read with great admiration a French philosopher, Pierre Gassendi, who has revived the ancient Greek philosophy of atomism, in which the world is understood to be composed of combinations of simple material units. For John Locke, this is a wonderful model for understanding the construction of ideas and knowledge. The simple units of experience, sensation, and reflection are combined by the mind into complex ideas based upon and unifying and new entities, but based upon the simple units of simple sensation and simple reflection. If all of our knowledge is linked to our ideas and totally dependent upon our ideas, and if all ideas arise from experience and there are no innate ideas, then it follows in Lockean epistemology, and it is one of the dramatic moments of early modern intellectual history when the culture embraces this side of Locke with such enthusiasm, that human knowledge is limited to our experience of the world, our experience of our senses, and of our own minds. Human knowledge is limited to and absolutely bound by human experience. Where there is no experience, there is no knowledge. This is what underlies the debate between Lockeans and Cartesians about the goal of fundamental natural philosophy. For what is Descartes asking? Think back. Descartes is asking, underlying, beneath, more real than the appearance of the ball of wax to me, as yellow, as having a specific odor, as having a specific ductility and malleability. What is the wax really? And it leads Descartes to the belief that extension in length, width, and breadth is the clear and distinct idea of that capable of appearing to us in those different forms. We know what matter is. We know what mind is. It is thought. Its essence is thought. It is incorporeal. It doesn't occupy space. We have real knowledge of the real substances, the real natures of the world. For Locke, the question, what underlies experience, obviously is unanswerable if our knowledge is limited to our experience. Imagine that all you knew was a room, and you could not see in any way outside that room, and you say, but the deep question is, what's outside the room? The Lockean answer is, that might be the deep question, what's outside the room. But it is unanswerable. No human mind can respond to that question. Our knowledge is bound by our experience. Unlike then, in the Cartesian system, in the Lockean system, we have no rational knowledge of the real nature of mind, of the real nature of matter. We have only our experience of the two. And the question, what underlies that experience? What is it of which that experience is a manifestation is an unanswerable question. Locke makes the distinction between what he calls nominal, in name only, and real essence. Descartes wanted to know real essence. Matter was extension. And we could deduce everything about physics from that. Mind was immaterial thought, and we could deduce everything metaphysically about mind from that. Locke says, in our experience, we pick out the most dramatic features of an entity. We say the most dramatic thing about a human being is that a human being is mortal and has choice. And hence we say that's what a human being is. But for us, it's just a marker. That's what we're going to mean by human being. We don't know what a human being really is. All we have is our experience of it. In the same way for Locke, we don't know the real essence of mind. We experience thought and will. So we say, when we talk about mind, we mean that which thinks and wills, but we don't know what it is made of. We don't know what underlies that experience. For all we know is experience. Looking at the material world, we say what the material world really is in the Cartesian system is extension, but in fact, all we can do is say we will call matter that which is extended. It is the most striking part of matter in our experience. It is its nominal essence, in name only. But God, not the human mind, which is limited by experience, alone knows what matter and mind really are. For Locke, this admission of ontological incapacity, our inability to answer questions about the real nature of things underlying our experience, is proper humility. For Descartes, it is clear that there is a categorical dualism between matter and thought. Locke clearly in his writing leans toward dualism, that we appear to be made of two kinds of stuff, human beings, bodies and minds. But we have no knowledge of that dualism. We cannot know what underlies that which we experience. We need to admit ignorance. We need to abase and lessen the claims of philosophy. And he will hurl the charge of theological danger against those who claim that his denial of real knowledge of dualism is in any way dangerous, by saying, if you believe that matter is incapable of thought, that we know that, as Descartes claims, here is what you are saying. God, in His omnipotence, if He chose, could not have created matter capable of thought. That is what you would have to argue. That you know, as a human being, that God, in His omnipotence, could not have created matter capable of thought. To say that we have real knowledge of an ontological dualism and of a real distinction between body and mind. Does that mean that Locke believes that matter is capable of thought? Not at all. And as I say, he leans in his work toward dualistic language. But philosophy can't answer that question. Human knowledge can't answer that question. We must admit our ignorance. And the Lockean agenda, then, is that the problem is not to know what mind is. We are not made for that knowledge, but how, in our experience, mind behaves. We need a psychology, not a metaphysics of mind. The problem is not to know what matter is, but how in our experience the world behaves. We need a physics and a set of sciences, not a metaphysics of matter. Such knowledge is based not on logic or innate ideas, but on experience, and thus it is always open to correction by further experience, and it is time for philosophy to understand the proper role of intellectual limits and humility. Thank you very much.